The sound was the first enemy. Not the loud sound of an explosion, but the cacophony of 1,000 tiny noises, merging into a physical wave that pressed against his chest. The murmur of hundreds of academics, the click of pens, the low, persistent hum of the auditorium lights, the shuffle of shoes on industrial carpet. For Luca de Vries, each of these sounds was a grain of sand accumulating, threatening to bury him. He clung to the wooden lectern, his knuckles white, trying to focus on his own words, but they were lost in static. Before him, a sea of faces, some curious, some bored, but one in particular, in the front row, destabilized him completely. It was the face of Michael Durand, the titan of astrophysics, a man whose work Luca had studied with a mixture of reverence and disagreement. And now, Durand's face was contorted into a sneer. Luca stammered, losing his train of thought about the interaction of subatomic particles in singularities. The microphone let out a sharp hiss. Luca flinched, and then Durand's voice cut through the air, not through the microphone but loud enough for everyone to hear. Frankly, that's enough. We're here to discuss science, not fantasies. What a dreamer. The word echoed, laden with scorn. Dreamer. The stifled laughter that followed was the final avalanche. Luca felt the world tilt, the lights becoming blinding stars about to explode. He stopped speaking. The silence that descended was heavier than the noise. Before I start, I wanted to ask a quick question. From what city or country are you following this story? Leave it in the comments. I love knowing how far these voices reach. And if you don't want to miss the outcome of journeys like Luca's, subscribe to the channel right now, so the algorithm doesn't make you forget about us. Luca's story, for his mother, Helena Svensson, didn't begin on that humiliating stage. It began on a kitchen floor, with hundreds of colorful building blocks, while other children built castles and cars. Luca, at 4 years old, organized the blocks by color, then by size, and then by a logic only he understood, forming complex, symmetrical patterns that covered the entire floor. He didn't speak much, but his eyes, when focused, seemed to hold entire universes. Helena knew her son was different, not in a bad way nor in a good way, just different. The world, however, didn't have much patience for different. At school, the teacher, a well-meaning woman named Chloe Haddad, kept sending notes home. Luca doesn't interact with others on the playground. Luca refuses to participate in the music circle. He stays in the corner looking at the lights. Luca had a meltdown today because I changed the arrangement of the desks. Each note was a small stab to Helena's heart. She tried to explain, to translate her son's world into the language of the school. She explained that the playground was too loud, that the lights were fascinating to him, that the unexpected change in the classroom was like an earthquake in his small, ordered universe. But she saw only confusion and a hint of pity in the teacher's eyes. The autism diagnosis came at 7, and while it was a relief to have a name for what they were experiencing, it also opened the door to a new labyrinth of labels and lowered expectations. Specialists suggested therapies to make him more functional, a euphemism Helena learned to hate, as it meant more like everyone else. They wanted to teach him to make eye contact, even though it caused him physical discomfort. They wanted to teach him to engage in small talk, even when his brain was busy deciphering the patterns of the Milky Way in a book. Helena fought a silent battle. At home, she created a sanctuary. The lights were soft, the noises controlled. Luca's room was his laboratory and his refuge. The walls were covered not with band posters, but with star charts and equations he copied from physics books borrowed from the library. It was there that he fell in love with the cosmos. For Luca, the universe wasn't chaotic. It was a system of perfect rules, even if we didn't fully understand them yet. It was predictable. The stars didn't lie. They didn't make jokes he didn't understand. They didn't demand he smile when he didn't feel like it. Adolescence was brutal. The social complexity of high school was an unsolvable equation. He was the weirdo who ate lunch alone, reading a book on quantum mechanics while others discussed sports and parties. The teasing was constant, not violent, but cutting. They called him robot, nerd genius. Each word was a scratch on his already fragile armor. Helena saw his pain, even if he didn't express it with tears. She saw it in the way he compulsively rubbed his hands after a school day, in the way he retreated for hours to his room, seeking calm in the logic of numbers. But it was also during this time that his brilliance became undeniable. His physics teacher, a man named John Perez Santos, was the first to see beyond the surface. One day he assigned an extra problem, a challenge that even the senior students couldn't solve. Luca submitted it the next day, not just with the answer, but with 3 different ways to arrive at it, one of which the teacher himself had never considered. Jan called Helena for a conversation. "Mrs. Svensson," he said, his eyes shining with enthusiasm, "your son isn't just good at physics. His mind, it operates in the same language as the universe. I've never seen anything like it." It was the first time in years Helena cried tears of joy. That validation was the fuel they needed. They focused everything on Luca's strength. He graduated with perfect grades in science and math and earned a full scholarship to a prestigious university. Helena felt a mix of overwhelming pride and deep fear. Would university be a place of brilliant minds who understood him, or just a larger, crueler version of high school? She helped him pack his small dorm room, adjusting the lighting, buying noise-canceling headphones, trying to build a small oasis for him in the midst of the unknown. As she said goodbye, she hugged him tight and whispered in his ear, "Just be you, my son. Your you is more than enough." It's extraordinary. But the academic world, she would soon discover, had its own rigid social rules, as unforgiving as any schoolyard. University promised to be a refuge, a place where intelligence would be the currency and social quirks a footnote. That was the hope, the false hope. Luca dove into his studies with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. He didn't go to parties. He didn't join noisy study groups in the library. His social circle consisted of 2 or 3 colleagues who appreciated his brain, like Matteo Lee, who understood that friendship with Luca meant long, comfortable silences and deep conversations about cosmological theories, without the need for pleasantries. However, the academic system isn't based solely on pure work. It demands collaboration, networking, the ability to sell your ideas. And that's where Luca failed spectacularly. In seminars, he was unable to simplify his complex theories for a broader audience. His mind saw all connections simultaneously, and he struggled to present them linearly. Other students, less brilliant but more charismatic, received praise for mediocre ideas, while Luca's revolutionary ones were often met with blank stares and awkward silences. The advice he received was always the same, wrapped in false solidarity. "Luca, you need to learn to communicate better," a well-meaning professor, Owen Zielinski Wilson, would say. "Your research is fascinating, but you need to be more approachable." Another suggested he attend social skills workshops. It will help you build bridges, secure funding in the future. Each piece of advice was a confirmation of his inadequacy. They weren't criticizing his work, they were criticizing the fundamental wiring of his brain. Asking Luca to be more approachable was like asking a bird to explain flight to a fish. They simply operated in different mediums. The pain of this was profound. He felt like an imposter, a defective genius. His work was the only thing that made sense, and now the world was telling him that without the right packaging, the content didn't matter. It was during his master's degree that he began to develop his theory on the quantum memory of singularities. It was a radical idea that united quantum mechanics and general relativity in a way no one had dared before. He saw the math in his mind, the equations unfolding with a breathtaking elegance. It was, to him, the truth. But when he presented the first drafts to his advisor, the reception was cool. "It's ambitious, Luca, perhaps too speculative. The scientific community isn't ready for this. Focus on something more publishable." The word, publishable, hit him like an insult. Wasn't science about seeking truth no matter how strange it seemed? He was being advised to abandon a potential revolution in favor of a safe footnote in an academic journal. The social pressure was immense. He watched colleagues form partnerships, publish papers together, build their careers brick by brick. He remained an island. Matteo Lee tried to help, acting as an informal translator of his ideas in study groups, but he couldn't always be by his side. Frustration began to corrode Luca's passion. He spent sleepless nights, not from the excitement of discovery, but from anxiety. He stared at the ceiling, replaying conversations, dissecting his own social failures. Why couldn't he just smile and agree? Why did a simple hallway chat leave him exhausted? This was false hope in its cruelest form. The belief that if he just tried harder, if he just tried to be normal, he would fit in and his work would be recognized. He tried. He attended a department networking event and spent the entire evening in a corner, overwhelmed by the noise, unable to initiate a single conversation. He tried to simplify his presentation in a seminar and ended up fumbling, feeling as though he was betraying the complexity of his own theory. Each attempt was a failure that reinforced the narrative that there was something wrong with him. The culmination of this journey of frustrated hopes was the decision to attend the international conference. It was Matteo who convinced him. "Luca, Michael Durand will be there. He's the only one working in a field close enough to understand what you're doing. You need to show him. It's your chance." The idea was terrifying, but Matteo's logic was sound. It was a high, desperate gamble. He spent months preparing, not just his research, but trying to rehearse a performance. He filmed himself, hated what he saw. He practiced in front of the mirror, feeling ridiculous. The hope was that the strength of his theory could break through the barrier of his personality. He foolishly believed that pure science would triumph. The conference was the embodiment of everything he found difficult: crowds, noise, superficial conversations, and the pressure to impress. And at the center of it all, Michael Durand, the man he hoped would understand him, became the architect of his greatest humiliation. The word dreamer wasn't just an insult. It was the world's final verdict on all his failed attempts to conform. It was confirmation that false hope was, indeed, a lie. Luca's conflict was never with a single person, but with a world built for a type of brain that wasn't his. Michael Durand wasn't a cartoon villain. He was the product of a system that values charisma as much as substance. Durand was a brilliant scientist, but also a showman. His lectures were legendary, filled with witty analogies and polished graphics. He saw science as a narrative, and Luca's narrative was messy, hesitant, without a clear climax. To Durand, the lack of polish in Luca's presentation was a reflection of a lack of rigor in his science. He didn't see a young scientist struggling with sensory overload. He saw an unprepared amateur, and in his arrogance, born of decades of acclaim, he dismissed him publicly. The real conflict, however, was deeper and quieter. It began at his childhood breakfast table. His father, a good but pragmatic man, never fully understood. He loved Luca, but he saw his difficulties as something to be overcome. "You just need to try harder, son," he'd say, with the best of intentions. "Look people in the eye. Give a firm handshake." To him, the world was a set of clear rules and success depended on following them. Luca's refusal or inability to do so was a source of constant, though silent, frustration for him. He was in denial, not of his love for his son, but of the immutable nature of his neurology. It was a small fracture in the foundation of the family, one that Helena spent her life trying to mend. At university, the conflict took the form of bureaucracy and skepticism. The head of research administration, Raphael Jung, looked at Luca's funding requests with suspicion. Luca was asking for access to expensive resources, like supercomputer time and radio telescopes, to test a theory that sounded like science fiction. "De Vries," Jung said in a meeting, "your proposal is unorthodox. We don't have published papers. We don't have solid preliminary data. We just have your equations." The implication was clear. Without the social proof of conventional success, resources were denied. It was a vicious cycle. To prove his theory, he needed data. But to get the data, he needed to convince people his theory was worth proving. It was a battle against institutional bias that favored incrementalism over revolution. The social gaze was a daily battlefield. It was the barista's impatience when Luca took a little too long to process an order. It was a colleague's sigh when he didn't understand a joke. It was the way people looked away when he started talking passionately about his work, his gestures becoming wider, his voice more monotone. Each of these micro-interactions was a reminder of his otherness. He wasn't hated. He was, in many ways, something worse. He was invisible, or when visible, an inconvenience. The most painful human conflict, however, was internal. One part of Luca knew his mind was exceptional. He could see patterns in the universe that no one else could. But another part was saturated with the world's voice, telling him he was broken. He wondered if Durand was right. Maybe he was just a dreamer. Maybe the beautiful equations in his mind were just that, dreams, with no connection to reality. Doubt was a slow poison. After the humiliation at the conference, this internal conflict reached a boiling point. He withdrew completely. He stopped responding to Matteo's emails, ignored his mother's worried calls. He sat in his small apartment, surrounded by books and notes that now seemed to mock him. That was the real dilemma: to give up, to accept that the world was right, to conform to a simpler, safer life where he wouldn't have to expose his vulnerable mind to further mockery. It would be easy. It would be painless. He could get a job as a data analyst, hidden behind a screen, dealing with the clean logic of numbers without the mess of human ambition. For almost a month, he allowed himself to sink into this abyss. The dream was dying. The conflict was almost over, with the world outside's overwhelming victory over his inner conviction. It wasn't a dramatic moment, but a slow fading of light. Quitting didn't feel like defeat, but like relief. The turning point didn't come with thunder, but with a soft knock at the door. Luca ignored it. The knock came again, patient without the urgency that would have made him retreat further. Finally, he opened the door a crack. It was Eva Romanov. Professor Romanov was a quiet legend in the physics department. She didn't seek the spotlight like Durand. She was nearly 70, with eyes that seemed to have witnessed the birth of galaxies. She published little, but when she did, her papers quietly shifted the field. She was known for her relentless rigor and her aversion to academic fads. "De Vries," she said, her voice calm and devoid of pity. "I heard what happened at the conference. Farce. Durand has always been more ego than science. May I come in?" Luca, stunned, opened the door. His apartment was a mess, with piles of books and papers scattered across the floor. Eva didn't seem to notice. Her eyes went straight to a whiteboard on the wall, covered from the first line to the last with Luca's equations. She approached, the silence stretching for several minutes as she read the math as if it were a poem. Luca stood still, his heart pounding. He expected a lecture, advice, perhaps even pity. Instead, she pointed to a specific line of the equation. "Here," she said, "you assumed a symmetric constant. Have you tried modeling this as an asymmetric matrix? It might resolve the energy anomaly in your simulations." It wasn't criticism. It was engagement. She wasn't talking to a social pariah. She was talking to a colleague. She was speaking the only language Luca mastered perfectly, the mathematics of the universe. In that moment, something within him reignited, a tiny spark in the midst of the ashes. For the first time in weeks, he spoke about his work. The words came out, hesitant at first, then in a torrent. He explained the implications, the barriers, the possibilities. Eva listened, nodding occasionally, asking incisive questions that forced him to think more deeply. They talked for 3 hours, surrounded by the chaos of his apartment. At the end, Eva walked to the door. "My lab has idle time on a supercomputer cluster," she said casually, "and I have a good relationship with the observatory in the desert. They owe me a favor. They can give you a few hours of observation time on the radio telescope. Send me your proposal. Not the version for the administrators, the real version." She didn't offer a hug or words of comfort. She offered something far more valuable: tools, respect, a chance. That was the silent turning point. It wasn't a rescue, it was empowerment. Eva didn't try to change Luca. She didn't care if he made eye contact or if he was good at small talk. She cared about the truth contained in his work. She gave him what he needed most: an environment where he could work without the noise of social judgment. Eva's lab became his new sanctuary. It was an underground space, quiet and with controlled lighting. There, he wasn't the weird autistic kid. He was just Luca, the physicist. He worked with renewed devotion. Eva's suggestion about the asymmetric matrix opened an entirely new path in his research, making his predictions even more accurate. He sent Eva updates by email, long texts filled with data and equations. Her replies were short, direct, and always contained a question that propelled him forward. Her help was an act of quiet rebellion against the system that had dismissed Luca. Eva knew that the greatest discoveries often come from minds that don't fit, from those who see the world from strange angles. She wasn't protecting Luca from the world. She was protecting science from the world. She was clearing the path for an important idea to be born, free from the pressure to conform. The change in Luca was gradual. He started taking care of himself again. The light in his eyes, which had dimmed, returned, not with the anxiety of before, but with the pure focus of discovery. His mother, Helena, noticed the difference in his calls. His voice was firmer, calmer. He spoke about his work with an excitement she hadn't heard in years. He didn't mention Eva Romanov by name for a long time. He just said, "I found a place where I can think." For Helena, those were the most beautiful words she had ever heard. The small victories began to accumulate, not like trophies on a shelf, but like solid foundation stones building a new foundation for Luca's confidence. The first victory was purely digital. After weeks of running his new simulations on Eva's supercomputer, a result appeared on the screen. It was a graph, an elegant curve that matched his theoretical predictions almost perfectly. For a long moment, Luca just stared, not breathing. It was no longer just a theory on a whiteboard. It was something the digital universe was confirming. He didn't shout with joy. Instead, a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It was a silent victory, witnessed only by the blinking server lights. He sent the graph to Eva with a single line of text. "I think we're on the right track." Her reply came minutes later. "I think so too. Now get the real-world data." The second victory came from the desert. The observation time at the radio telescope was precious. Luca had a window of only 4 hours on a moonless night to point the antenna towards a specific region of space, near a neutron star, where his theory predicted subtle anomalies in the cosmic microwave background. He operated the telescope remotely from his lab, his heart beating in a steady rhythm with the flow of raw data arriving. It was like hearing a whisper from the universe. After days of processing, filtering out the noise, he finally obtained a signal. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A distortion in space-time exactly as his asymmetric equations had predicted. It was the first physical evidence. He called Matteo Lee his university friend. For the first time there was no hesitation in his voice. "Matteo, it happened. I found it." On the other end of the line, there was a moment of silence, followed by an exclamation of pure joy from Matteo. "I knew it, Luca. I always knew." That validation from a friend, who had been with him through the worst, was as significant as the data on the screen. Another victory, perhaps the most important, was personal in nature. One day, Eva found him in the lab staring at a complex set of data. "Explain it to me," she said, as if I were 5 years old. It was a test, but not a cruel one. It was an invitation for him to practice communication in a safe environment. Luca hesitated. He would normally dive into technical jargon, but he looked at Eva, who waited patiently, and tried. He used an analogy. "Imagine a black hole is like a hard drive," he began. "It doesn't delete information, it stores it, in a different language we didn't know how to read yet. I think I've found the first letters of that alphabet." Eva smiled, a rare and genuine smile. "That was good," she said. "Now, explain it as if I were a skeptical physicist." And they spent the next hour doing just that, with Eva playing the role of devil's advocate, forcing Luca to defend every point of his theory. He didn't feel attacked. He felt challenged. He was learning to build armor for his ideas, not for himself. With each week, he felt stronger. He began collaborating via email with other niche scientists Eva knew, like Kenji Martin, a researcher in Japan working on a tangential problem. Their exchanges were purely about science, free from the need for small talk. He was building his own network, on his own terms. The biggest small victory came during a visit from his mother. Helena entered Luca's lab and found him in the middle of his work. He was standing before a massive whiteboard, completely absorbed, gesturing to himself as he worked out an equation. He didn't hear her arrive. She stood in the doorway watching him. He didn't look anxious nor tormented. He looked at peace, in his element, like a fish back in water. When he finally noticed her, his surprise was brief. He turned to her, and instead of the distant look she often saw, his eyes were clear and focused. "Mom," he said with a tone of genuine excitement, "come see. I want to show you something." He led her to the computer screen and showed her the signal from the radio telescope. She didn't understand the data, of course, but she understood the vibrant passion in his voice, the confidence in his posture. In that moment, she knew he would be all right. He hadn't been fixed. He had found his place. And that was a greater victory than any award or public recognition could be. The most profound transformation in Luca wasn't external. He didn't suddenly become a charismatic orator or a social butterfly. He still preferred silence to conversation, order to chaos. The change was internal, a fundamental reevaluation of his own identity. The word dreamer, hurled like a weapon by Michael Durand, began to lose its sting. Instead of a source of shame, Luca began to see it in a new light. What was a scientist but a disciplined dreamer? Copernicus dreamed of a heliocentric solar system. Einstein dreamed of riding a beam of light. Every great scientific leap began with a dream, an imagination that dared to go beyond what was known and accepted. Durand, in his attempt to insult him, had inadvertently given Luca the most accurate and powerful label of all. He was a dreamer, and he was learning not to be ashamed of it. He began to reflect on his journey, not with bitterness, but with analytical clarity. He realized that the pain he had felt for most of his life didn't come from autism itself. It came from the constant friction between his nature and the expectations of a neurotypical world. It was like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole day after day. The exhaustion didn't come from complex thought, but from the effort to simulate a normalcy that wasn't his. In the refuge of Eva's lab, free from that pressure, his mind could finally operate at its full capacity. He realized that his sensitivity to noise wasn't a weakness but a byproduct of a brain that perceived the world with a higher resolution. His need for routine wasn't rigidity, but a way to conserve mental energy for the tasks that truly mattered. His difficulty with small talk wasn't a social failing, but an aversion to wasting processing power on irrelevant information. He was rewriting his own instruction manual. True acceptance came in an unexpected moment. He was reading an old paper by Durand, one that had inspired him years ago. He saw the elegance in Durand's math, the brilliance in his insights, and for the first time he felt no resentment, no intimidation. He felt a purely scientific connection. He could respect Durand's work, and at the same time, see where Durand had stopped, where his own theory took the next step. He didn't need Durand's approval to validate his own worth. His worth was in the equations, in the data, in the truth he was uncovering. That realization freed him. He stopped seeing himself as a defective version of other people and started seeing himself as a perfectly functional version of himself. His mother, Helena, witnessed this change poignantly. In one of their video calls, she saw him stimming, rocking gently back and forth as he processed a complex thought. In the past, he would have tried to suppress it, aware of how strange it looked to others. But now he did it openly, without shame. It was just part of his thought process, as natural as breathing. Helena said nothing, but her eyes filled with tears. It was the sight of her son, finally at home in his own skin. This deep reflection led him to a new way of interacting with the world. He no longer tried to fit in. Instead, he began to build bridges on his own terms. In his email collaborations, he was direct and clear about his needs. "I communicate best in writing," he'd say. "Please send your thoughts in a detailed email rather than scheduling a call." People, for the most part, respected it. He was learning to advocate for himself, not with aggression, but with factual clarity. He understood that the pain of the past wouldn't be erased. The scars of humiliation and isolation would remain, but they no longer defined him. They were just data, points on a graph showing how far he had come. He was no longer a problem to be solved. He was a scientist about to prove the theory of the century. The climax of Luca's journey didn't happen on a brightly lit stage with thunderous applause. It happened in the same way as his turning point, quietly, but with the power of an earthquake. With Eva Romanov's guidance, he compiled his years of work. The simulations, the radio telescope data, the refined equations. Everything was brought together into a single paper. It was dense, impenetrable to the uninitiated, but to those who spoke the language of physics, it was a work of art. There were no flourishes, no easy analogies. It was simply the truth, supported by irrefutable evidence. They didn't submit it to flashy, high-impact journals that favored sensational stories. Eva sent it to the most rigorous and respected publication in the field, one known for its brutally honest peer review process. Months passed in silence. Luca continued his work, already exploring the next questions his theory raised. He had learned to detach himself from the outcome. The work itself was the reward. Then, an email arrived. The article had been accepted. Not just accepted, but praised by anonymous reviewers as potentially the most significant contribution to cosmology this decade. The publication sent a shockwave through the scientific community. At first, there was skepticism. Who was Luca de Vries? But the data was undeniable. Laboratories around the world began to try to replicate his observations, and one by one, they confirmed his results. The theory was no longer a dream. It was an observable fact. The revenge against Michael Durand was never something Luca actively sought, but it came nonetheless in a perfectly poetic way. There was no confrontation, no apology was uttered. Instead, the scene unfolded thousands of miles away. Durand was in his office, overlooking the campus of his prestigious university. A colleague, Francesco Ito, left a copy of Luca's paper on his desk. "You should read this, Michael. It's about the memory of singularities. That kid from that conference. The dreamer." Durand scoffed, but curiosity got the better of him. He began to read, skepticism etched on his face. As he progressed, his expression changed. Disdain gave way to concentration, then surprise, and finally, something akin to awe. He stood up and went to his own whiteboard, scribbling Luca's equations, trying to find a flaw, a logical error. There was none. The math was perfect. The evidence? Solid. He stood there for a long time, staring at the board, the silence of his office echoing the silence of the auditorium months before. He hadn't just been proven wrong. His entire paradigm had been surpassed. It was a complete intellectual defeat, and there was no one to blame but his own arrogance. The true closure for Luca wasn't Durand's downfall, but a much quieter scene. Weeks later, he received an email. The sender was a name he didn't recognize. Ni Rodriguez, an undergraduate student at a university in Argentina. "Dr. de Vries," the email began, "I read your paper and it changed the way I see the universe. I'm also autistic and have always felt my mind worked differently. Seeing someone like you succeed on your own terms gave me hope. Thank you." Luca read the email several times. The pain of the past hadn't magically disappeared. He would still have days of sensory overload. He would still prefer the company of stars to crowds. But now he had tools, not just to survive, but to thrive. He had a community, even if it was a community of like-minded minds scattered across the globe. And he had a purpose. Hope wasn't in the promise of a pain-free future, but in the certainty that his unique perspective was not only valid, but necessary. He looked at the computer screen, at the new data coming in, at the new questions arising from his own discoveries. He picked up the keyboard and began to reply to the young student's email. And then he went back to work. The universe was full of dreams, and he had barely begun to decipher them. The truth is, the world doesn't always make space for the minds it needs most. Sometimes those minds have to build their own space brick by brick, equation by equation. The universe doesn't care about charisma, it responds to truth. And Luca's journey teaches us that the greatest strength isn't in conforming, but in finding the courage to be authentically who you are, even if the world calls you a dreamer. If this story touched you in any way, if it made you think or feel, please like it, comment with your reflection, and subscribe to the channel. Your interaction helps this message reach further. And maybe, just maybe, someone who is feeling invisible needs to hear this today.